In today's video, we're going to go over my top 5 reasons why I chose the WRX over the STI and give you some pros and cons between both to help you better decide which one's right for you. What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. First things first, I want to say thank you once again to all my new subscribers. You guys push me to keep making content, so thank you. So to start out, my first reason why I chose the WRX over the STI was price. Now, I was coming from a 2016 F-150 EcoBoost to this, and one of the main driving factors why I chose to go to this was the price. I was tired of paying over $500 a month for a truck payment, so I wanted to get something that was a little bit cheaper, a little more practical, and still fun, and here we are. Now, to give a little context here for any of you guys that have not watched any of my previous videos, this is a 2021 WRX Premium, which is the middle tier of the 3 trim packages available for the WRX. They came with the base, the premium, and the limited was the top tier. Now, at the time of recording this, the MSRP on, like the one you see behind me here, was just a little over $30,000, whereas the STI was just a little over $37,000. Now, MSRP typically isn't what you're gonna pay for a vehicle, and it varies depending on location. I paid just a little over $32,000 for this car here. Now, once again, wherever you buy your car from, that price is going to vary, and especially right now with the shortage of cars, the prices typically have started to go up a little bit. Now, on the topic of price, that leads me into my second reason why I chose the WRX over the STI, and that is price to performance. Now, it was no surprise when Subaru released the FA20 DIT that it was going to respond fairly well to modifications, as we saw on a lot of other manufacturers' platforms that used the direct injection engines. Now, to put this into context, a Stage 2 Plus package, which consists of an access port, an intake, and a full turbo back exhaust, on the WRX, you're looking at 315 wheel horsepower and about 330 wheel torque. Now, if you were to do that same package on the STI, that would net you around 285 wheel horsepower and about 285 wheel torque. Now, that's going to vary depending on different factors, elevation, the fuel being used, yada yada yada. But for about the same price as far as aftermarket components are concerned, this car makes considerably more power. Now, my third reason is fuel economy. So with most direct injection engines, they are fairly well known to make more power while using less fuel due to how direct injection works, essentially. Now, I'm not going to get too much into why direct injection makes more power than a port injection engine, but to give you a brief summary, basically, on a direct injection motor, the fuel is being sprayed directly into the cylinder, whereas a port injection engine, it's sprayed behind the intake valves. Now, because it's being sprayed into the cylinder, it's going to create better atomization of that fuel, and also create a cooling effect in the cylinder itself, which means you can run more timing, which means more power. But because of this better optimized fueling, there is a byproduct of that, and that is typically better fuel economy. Not always is that the case, but for the most part, most direct injection engines have better fuel economy than their port injection counterparts. Now, as far as fuel economy is concerned, Subaru rates the WRX for 20 miles per gallon in the city and about 27 on the freeway. I have actually seen a little bit better numbers than that on the freeway. I'm getting more around the 30 miles per gallon mark on the freeway, whereas the STI, you're looking at about 16 in the city and about 22 on the highway. Now, these numbers vary greatly depending on how you drive the car and where the car is driven. So your mileage may vary. Now, my fourth reason is probably a little bit subjective, but I wanted something that had a newer engine platform than the typical EJ series motor you saw on all the other previous generations of WRX and STI. Now my fifth and final reason why I chose the WRX over the STI is availability. Now when I picked this car up, there really wasn't very many cars on the market, at least in my area. Due to COVID and manufacturing being shut down for so long, the availability of these cars was not that great. And I'm honestly surprised I even found one when I was looking, because most of the cars in the dealerships I was looking at, the cars they were getting in were already spoken for before they even showed up at the dealerships themselves. Now I want to get into some of the pros and cons between the WRX and the STI and some of the differences that you might want to know about essentially. Now, one of the big differences, of course, is the fact that the WRX has a new engine platform that they released in 2015. As I mentioned, it's the FA20 DIT. Now, depending on how you look at that, that can be a pro or a con. To me, I think it's a pro. It's a totally new platform that I think has a lot of great benefits going for it. There is some cons to it as well. Now, being direct injection, there is the issue of intake valves getting gummed up with carbon buildup, and most of that can be remedied with an air oil separator, but it's just something to consider. Now, I think one of the biggest cons to the WRX is probably the transmission and just other drivetrain components that are associated with that. Now, most people probably don't know this, but the transmission that is in the WRX is a, of course, 6-speed manual transmission, unless you got the CVT option. And it actually is pretty much the same transmission that was in previous generation WRXs that used the 5-speed gearbox. The only difference really they made was they added the 6th gear, changed up the gear ratios a bit, and then they went from a linkage style shifter to a cable style shifter. Now, the transmission that came in the STIs, as well as the axles and rear end, were far superior to what came in the WRX in pretty much every year. Now, another con that is kind of subjective, or depending on what you're planning on doing with the car, is the braking system. Now, it's no surprise that the STI, being the more expensive model, is going to have all the bells and whistles, and one of those is the Brembo brakes. Now, the brakes on this car, I'm not going to say are bad, but if you were to go push the car really hard on a track of some sort, you're going to notice some issues. The brakes on this car are very prone to heat fade, and some of that can be remedied with different pads and different rotors, something to dissipate the heat a little bit better. But from the factory, the STI brakes, or the Brembos that came with the STI, are much, much better. Now, going into some pros on the WRX over the STI. The WRX, surprisingly, well, actually not surprisingly, is a little bit lighter of a car than the STI, and that is most likely due to the fact that the STI has a little bit more technologies in it and a little bit more beefed up components, so it's no surprise that it's going to be heavier. To put that into context, the WRX weighs anywhere from a little over 3,200 pounds up to 3,300 pounds, and the STI weighs anywhere from 3,400 pounds up to 3,500 pounds, depending on which trim package you. Now, another pro to the WRX is the fact that it makes a lot more power, or it's a lot more responsive down low. And what I mean is, the car makes more power down in the lower RPM range and then kind of falls off in the top, whereas the STI is kind of lazy down low and makes more power up top. Now, what this equates to is a car that's a lot more fun to drive in really tight areas, such as like twisty back roads, because power comes on so quick, or I mean just in the city. Power is there pretty much instantaneously thanks to the twin scroll turbo setup that is on this car. Now, there is a few other little differences between the two. One of them is the steering ratio on the STI was a bit tighter, which equated to a little bit heavier steering feel, and less input equaled more turning essentially. One other little difference, and this is gonna be kind of something that's only gonna matter if you're gonna leave the car stock, but the STI came with a little bit stiffer suspension from the factory than the WRX. I've driven both cars personally, and I don't notice a huge difference, but it is claimed that the STI is a little bit stiffer, which would make sense being that it's the more performance-oriented version of the car. And then a lot of the other real key differences between the cars are going to be interior and a few little exterior differences. Now, typically on most STIs, unless you get a wingless version, you get the wing that everyone kind of knows is the STI wing. The other thing that you actually lose, unless you get a limited STI, is the sunroof. The base model STI does not come with a sunroof. And that was mostly due to the fact it made the car a little bit lighter and actually stiffened up the chassis a bit. And then most of the other differences were all interior based. The STI usually came with a Alcantara suede kind of seat, whereas the WRX only came in a cloth or leather, except for in 2020, well actually 2018 I think it was, they came out with the WRX Premium Performance Package, which came with the Recaro seats, which were pretty much similar or the same thing that came in the STI. One other thing that you actually lose with the STI on the current body style as far as 2021s are concerned, and in fact I believe this happened in 2018, was you lost the fog lights. You no longer had fog lights. Basically where the fog light bezel goes, it's just a big vent, or what looks like a vent essentially. Now, a lot of the things on this particular car that you would consider cons can be remedied pretty easily if you have enough money to do it. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but even though this is a totally different engine platform than the EJ series motors, the FA series motors will actually bolt up to the EJ series transmissions. So that means you could actually swap a STI transmission and drivetrain into one of these cars, and it has been done before. Now, to do that, you need a couple things. Well, more than a couple things really. You need the transmission, you need the axles, you need the rear end, and then you also need some form of DCCD controller and an adapter to adapt the wiring harness from the WRX wiring harness to the STI transmission. Now, to do an STI transmission swap on these cars, you're looking anywhere from $4,000 to $5,000 depending on where you're buying it from, but that seems to be the average cost to get a transmission, the axles, the rear end, basically everything except for the DCCD controller, and those kind of vary in price depending on the setup that you want to go with. But you can buy one for anywhere from $500 up to $1,000 if you want to get crazy. Now, the other thing that's an easy change that was a con essentially to this car over the STI was the brakes. Now, in 2020 they did release a premium performance package which actually came with Brembos, and that was really kind of the big main difference though between that car and the other cars as far as the WRX is concerned. They did change the interior, as I mentioned earlier, to seats that were similar to what you would get in the STI, but you also lost a few features in the process. You actually lost the sunroof, being that the performance package was performance oriented. They wanted a car that was a little bit lighter for one, and two, they wanted something that had a little bit more rigidity to the body. Now, if you were to want to put Brembos on a WRX, it's a pretty easy process. Pretty much you would get the Brembos from say a 2008 to 2017 STI, unless you want the 6-pot calipers that came on the 2018 to current generation STI. But you would get the Brembos front and rear. You would need the rotors off of a 2015 to 2017 STI front and rear, and you would need the brake hoses from the STI as well as any other associated hardware like banjo bolts and the actual caliper bolts that hold the calipers to the knuckles. Now, one thing to note, there is one small modification that you have to do to the back of the vehicle when you switch over to Brembos on the WRX, and that is actually trimming the backing plate on the brake system. The bigger rotor of the STI does rub on that backing plate, and you could probably get a whole backing plate off of an STI, but it would be a pain to swap out just because of how the bearing system is assembled back there. Now the cost for Brembos kind of varies depending on where you get them at, but you're looking anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 typically for the parts to do a Brembo swap. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed my top 5 reasons why I chose the WRX over the STI, and hopefully some of this information will help you better decide which car is right for you. As always, if you like the video, smash that like button. Lets me know that you like the content I'm creating and I can make more of it for you guys. And if you aren't subscribed yet, consider subscribing. We're pushing for 1,000 subscribers and hopefully someday beyond that. And as always, comment down below if you have any questions. I will respond to each and every one of you guys. And I actually really love responding to you guys. It's nice to interact with you guys a little bit. That being said, we will see you in the next one.